Yeah, my name's Alice Deignan. I've been interested in vocabulary and vocabulary teaching for a long time, originally as a foreign language teacher. And as Tony mentioned, I've also worked as a lexicographer, which is where I first got interested in corpora so long ago. I'm kind of embarrassed to say, but let's just say I've seen developments over the years. I'm working in a school of education, as Tony mentioned, and I've become very interested in what my colleagues do who work in schools, that is in British schools, with largely native speakers. We have some ESL students, but not actually very many, proportionately. And what I've become really interested in is the native speaker challenge. A few years ago, I did a project that involved interviewing school students. The groups that I was interested in were aged between 11 and 16, but I was interviewing school students aged 14 and 15 about their understandings of climate science for a project, and we were actually looking at the metaphors in there. And I've got some examples here which I hope are clear from my screen. Here I was interested in the word release, okay? And these are two quotations from these school students who, as I say, were native speakers of English, doing fine in their science, more or less, not the highest achievers, but they were doing okay. And just to read the first one. If we're recycling stuff like the landfills, I don't know, it releases something like, you know, less landfills and less pollution and stuff like this. This student is trying to use the semi-technical term release, which is used to talk about carbon dioxide being produced into the atmosphere as a result of burning and hence greenhouse gases. So they've heard the word release in their science classes, and I felt from this citation and from the next one as well, it was fairly clear that a significant number of the students were not able to use that word correctly. I've put some stuff in green there because I was looking for, okay, so what is the object or the subject of this? And it was pretty vague, basically. Now, release is a very common word in English, and these students as native speakers, there's no way that they don't know the everyday meaning, which is associated with coming out of prison or confinement, and it's or associated with a new song or a book coming out, but they were not able to use it in this way. And I was fascinated by that, and I got really interested in how the language of school is actually so different from everyday language, and yet by and large, a lot of teachers aren't really aware of it, and there's no reason why they would be. I'm not blaming the teachers. Okay, this is another example of the word response, which was used in climate science and in science more generally. We often use the metaphor response to talk about a reaction or something that is caused by something else as part of a natural chain of events. So we get this, for example, the third one, shaped by orbital variations, responses such as the rise and fall in continental ice sheets and so on. And these sources that are in brackets here, Climate Central, Geographical, Wikipedia, were all sources that were cited by school students as this is where they get information from. Okay, so you've got a use of response there. Now, when we look at the everyday response, everyday use of response, this is from the BNC 2014, the spoken corpus, and you can see it's different. It's mostly literal, it has human agency, it's about people talking, it's not about scientific cause and effect. So I got really interested in whether there's actually a problem for students with this language. So we talked to teachers early on. As I said, we're in a school of education. We train teachers. We have strong links with our local schools. And it's just really interesting to take corpus linguistics to look at those problems. It hasn't been done that much before in this part of the world. So this is a discussion with a history teacher who we talked to while we were developing these ideas. He said, children are able to think, but they can't articulate their thoughts because of the lack of language. It's not the concepts they're finding difficult at Key Stage 3, it's the ability to access material given to them. Key Stage 3 is the first part of high school. I'm not going to talk at length about this because I know it's not relevant to most of you, but just a little bit of the background. For schools in England and Wales, the parts that I'm really interested in here are outlined in red: Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, which is the end of primary school, or you might call it elementary school, and the beginning of secondary school, or you might call it high school or college. Okay, so I'm interested in those particular areas, and at some points in the talk I'll be talking about Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, but it's that interface between primary school and secondary school. Okay, we talk in England about the transition, and we're talking about primary school or elementary school and going up to secondary school. These are very different environments for children. The pictures I've taken here, they're in the public domain, they're on the internet. They're actually all from schools that we've worked with, in fact. So the top is one primary school near us. In Britain, children wear uniform for school, you'll see from here. And below we've got a class photo. Again, that's from the internet, it's in the public domain. The adult standing in the back on the left of that photo on the left is Daniel Hackney, who's one of the teachers who worked with us. And those children worked with us as well. Those two primary schools are typical of a primary school in the part of England where I live and work, in that each year they have an intake of 30 children, which forms one single class, one single year group. And those 30 children go through the 7 years of primary school together, more or less. A few children leave and a few join because of moving house and so on, but very small numbers. Essentially, the core group stay together all through primary school until they're 11. And when they're 11, they move to a secondary school. Now, the secondary school here is the one that all of these children now attend. It has an intake of 240 children a year, as opposed to the 30 in primary school. And the children are now, or students we should call them now rather than children, even though they're only 11 years old. They are now taught in very mixed groups. They are immediately put into different groups according to their ability in different subjects. So they may be in a different class with different groups of children for every subject that they study. And their teachers are now subject specialists rather than child-centred teachers who cover pretty much the whole curriculum. And the environment is very, very different. One of the pictures I've put here is an exam taking place at a secondary school, and this is very, very typical. They didn't happen this summer, of course, but this is what usually happens. Okay, so it's a big shock for those young people. The evidence has shown that there's an academic drop at that point. I sometimes think of this as if you've got a plant that you've been growing in a glass house in Britain where the climate is cold. And then come the springtime, you put it outside to grow. And often it stops growing for a short while because of the shock of the cold. And it's almost like this is what happens to young people. There's a dip in attitudes and attainments. And this is, teachers have talked about this for a long time. They talk about the transition dip. But it's evidenced as well. So the quotations here are from work that studied this. And the second quotation was interesting to me because the characteristics of pupils that are particularly affected include pupils receiving free school meals. Pupils receiving free school meals are children whose family income is below a certain level, and they're really quite poor, quite badly off in order to qualify for free school meals. This would be, it depends on the school and the area, but it might be 20% of the intake at a typical school. So, and children who haven't done so well before, with low self-esteem and so on. So for these children, there will be a drop. And what is of great concern to teachers and of course to society at large is that there is a significant portion of those children who don't recover from that dip. They're 11 or 12 at this point. If they don't pick up again from that dip, their future is at risk. They're unlikely to do well in the school leaving exams, which happen when they're 15 or 16. And if they don't do well in those exams, they have a higher than random chance of being in prison later on. Obviously, I'm not suggesting it's all to do with schooling. There are multiple factors here. But this drop in attainment is something that needs to be taken really seriously. Okay. And then, because I'm a linguist, I'm really interested in language and the transition. So the quotation here, that in teaching environments and teaching language, teachers' language is very different, because as I mentioned earlier, the teachers in secondary schools are subject specialists. Teachers in primary schools, by and large, teach most of the subjects on the curriculum, and they see the children all day. They know the children really well. The quotations from textbooks that I've got here, the first one, Fossils, is from the top end of primary school, and the multicoloured one, Animal and Plant Cells, is from the beginning of secondary school, from Key Stage 3. The density of the text is quite similar, but the one on fossils, you can see, as linguists yourselves, you can see that there's a lot of everyday language. It's quite personalised, and the explanation leading to the semi-technical word fossils and geologists, there's quite a lot of detail there. The excerpt from plant biology, Animal and Plant Cells have similarities, uses loads of colour, different typeface, a diagram, in an attempt to make this easier, but there's a huge density of technical terms there. So, and this is, school students might be seeing the fossils text in May and the Animal and Plant Cells text in September or October of the same year. So we're looking at a big jump in the kind of language, the way things are presented, and the complexity. So we have a project at the moment which has been funded in the UK to investigate this problem, and that's the formal title of it. The slides I've uploaded already, and the last slide has a bit more detail. I'm working together with Lancaster University on this, so the names Elena Semino and Václav Brezina are probably familiar to you. And my co-investigators from the University of Leeds are both educationalists, so you may not know them as well, but they're both experts in school teaching. Gary is an expert in modern foreign languages, and Michael is a former physics teacher and trains physics teachers. And then I've had a number of very, very talented research fellows working on this. Marcus, whose name is at the bottom of the slide, is a teacher. He leads literacy work, and he's an English teacher at a school near us. And working with him has just been fantastic, because it feels like we've got a real join between the corpus linguistics and the application, and he's helped us to shape the project. He's been great. Okay, so we're building corpora, of course, And we're working with 13 schools across the north of England. We have 5 secondary schools and we have 8 primary schools. Now, of the primary schools, 5 of them, what we term feed 3 of the secondary schools. So I already gave you an example of that with the photos, where those 2 primary schools directly fed a secondary school. A large secondary school might have 8 feeder primary schools, and it might draw students from other areas as well, but you often get this sort of a throughput from a primary to a secondary. And we wanted to work with these groups of schools where one school feeds another, because we wanted to track what happens and to look across the schools. We tried to get a mix of attainment schools, but we are very much biased towards the higher achieving schools. The schools that are really struggling were interested in the project, but the teachers are just so busy, so overcommitted. It's very difficult for them to work with us on research. But we do have one really struggling school that we've worked with. So to build Corpus was not easy. It was not, I thought it would be a lot easier than it was. We asked them to start with to upload written teaching materials via OneDrive, but the problems, it was just endlessly problematic. And a lot of it was my university's fault rather than the school's fault. They just weren't good at doing it. And in the end, what happened was the project research fellow, 𝗪𝗪𝗱𝗂𝗪 𝗪𝗪𝗱𝗂𝗪, physically collected a lot of material on USB sticks from schools. There was a lot of cleaning that was needed to do that, because teachers would just give 𝗪𝗪𝗱𝗂𝗪, the research fellow, a USB stick and say, here you are, here's the material. And when she looked at it, it would have maybe multiple versions of the same presentation. Sometimes they were a mess, basically, and she had to go through it. She had to be careful about confidentiality and so on. So it was a lot of work. Textbooks have been scanned, and we've had research assistants and actually some school students who we've paid to help with that as well. And that took a lot of cleaning, because the format of the textbooks was really messy. If you think of that excerpt about plants and animal cells that I just showed you, it was kind of, a lot of it was like that. So we've got a school materials corpus now. Thousands of files, several million words, a lot of sorting and cleaning. And we've also recorded spoken data, and we got that teachers wore a microphone on a lanyard, and again we physically collected the microphone. Now, we didn't want student speech, because what we were looking at was what the students encounter. We didn't want what students produce. So we only recorded the teachers, and the teacher talk has been transcribed by an external agency, which has helped us with confidentiality, and not needing student talk really helped with the ethics as well. It made the ethical clearance a lot less complicated. So we've got lots of data, wasn't easy to get hold of. This is the kind of stuff that we've got then. So we've got written data from Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, which, as I said, is primary and secondary. We've got worksheets, textbooks, exams, assessment tasks, and so on. And then we've got audio recordings of lessons, teacher utterances only. At the bottom, I've said which subjects we got. We got English, maths, science, history, and geography. Those, together with a modern foreign language, are the prestigious subjects that are entered into, that students need to do well in, essentially. But we didn't want foreign language data, of course. That would have it would have been irrelevant to what we are trying to do. We also interviewed pupils and teachers for qualitative analysis, and we didn't put that data into a corpus. Okay, so these are the corpora that we're still finishing cleaning up, but essentially we've got them. So the Key Stage 2 corpus, we've got data from the last 2 years at primary school when children are aged 9 to 11. And then we've got Key Stage 3 data from the first 2 years at secondary school when children are aged 11 to 13 years. and we are designing at the moment a reference corpus. So what we're trying to do with the reference corpus is to replicate the language that school students experience outside school. So using the BNC 2014, the Oxford Children's Corpus, and we're looking around for what we can do for that reference corpus. Okay, the interview data then. This isn't a corpus part of the project, but it's been really fascinating. I'm so glad we did it. Using the schools, including the 2 schools that were in the photograph that I showed you, the photographs that I showed you earlier on of primary schools. We had 30 students. We used 5 different primary schools, and we asked the teachers to choose 6 students from the classes for us to interview of a mixed range of ability. So we've interviewed them 4 times. We interviewed them twice while they were still in primary school, including before and after the compulsory tests that they do. So when we interviewed them in June 2019, they were just starting to get really excited about going to secondary school. They'd done their final exams and they were visiting the schools that they were going to move to. And then they had the summer vacation, which is about 6 weeks in England, and they went to their new schools in September 2019. They went to 3 different secondary schools. And then it was more complicated. We couldn't get them together as a group because they were kind of dispersed all around the school. But the secondary schools were very helpful, and they found these pupils and brought them back to us. And actually, we didn't lose any, which is quite unusual. I think we didn't lose any. So we spoke to them in October 2019, and we spoke to them in February 2020. And in the UK, schools closed on March the 20th. So we're not going to do the final interviews. Even if we were able to at this point, the COVID crisis would have overshadowed everything else. Okay, some of the things we got from interviews. What do you think you'll find difficult? And school students, they talked a lot about words, actually. They talked about words and language and words that are hard words. And new subjects, and then they reflected on that later on. My colleagues who are educationalists are writing that stuff up, okay, and they're writing that up they've presented at education conferences, and it's really interesting looking at what the young people have said alongside the corpus stuff. Coming to the corpora then, the current size, because we're not quite finished yet, but we've got a number of main divisions. And sorry, I see that somebody's just asked. I'm curious as to why the pupils' written work is not added to the corpus. Okay, yeah, it's a really good question. What I was interested in for this project is what the students experience. So I was interested in their receptive knowledge. I wasn't interested at that point in their productive knowledge. So that's why we just stuck to the teacher stuff. I mean, what pupils write is really, really important, obviously. But it wasn't what we were looking at here. And there are other projects on that which are really, really worth looking at. Okay, looking at another question. Oh, I hope that the native speaker challenge has been covered, but if not, I'll happily do that at the end. And Eric from down the road in Leeds has asked, what's a word problem in algebra? I'm not quite sure, I'm afraid, what a 10-year-old means by a word problem. But one of the things that we found, and I don't think I've got this on these slides, was that in mathematics in primary school, problems tend to be very much framed in terms of, okay, things like Emma has a ladder, she puts it against the wall, and then, you know, you need to calculate what angle the shadow is at or whatever. or Charlie has 5 sweets. They're framed like that. I think the student was referring to the kind of complex algebraic notation, and some of the grammatical structures as well in mathematics are quite complex. There's a grammar structure. If so and so is X, what is Y, which is a kind of a conditional structure, but it's never taught directly as a structure. I think for teachers it goes under the radar, but it's quite difficult, and I think that there was some awareness of that, but I can't be quite sure. Okay, so our main divisions, the corpus is sliced a couple of different ways. Key stage 2 and key stage 3, of course, is the main division, but also written versus spoken. And I've put the numbers here, and this is more or less where we're at the moment. We've got more data that we haven't transcribed, and of course we'd love to transcribe it all, but we've only got about 7 months left of the project. We've been delayed by the current crisis, and we need to analyse it. I hope at some point we'll be able to transcribe more data. It was fantastic to what extent teachers and schools were willing it was fantastic how much they were willing to give data. I thought they wouldn't give us data. I thought they wouldn't want to record themselves. They were fine with it, absolutely fine. Some of the problems that we had to deal with were the English subcorpus became very, very large very quickly because of all the children's literature that they read. So we're putting that in a separate corpus now. I hope that we will have time. Elena Semino is an expert in stylistics, so she's going to be looking at that in terms of stylistic issues for children. And then how to weight the different subjects. English and maths get a huge amount of class time, especially in primary school, key stage 2, and the other subjects get less, but the other subjects present a lot of really interesting language problems. Okay, so early on, we used AntConc when we were doing kind of fairly preliminary work. We're now using Lanxbox, and we're doing various kinds of comparisons, and this is work in progress right now. So we're looking at all subjects in primary versus all subjects in secondary, and then we're looking at specific subjects, and then we're looking at separate years. How do words and structures change from year 5, which of course is when they're aged 9 to 10, through to year 8, which is when they're aged 12 to 13. So if you follow a subject like science or geography all the way through, what sort of changes do you see? And then there's a comparison with language outside the school. This is just a tiny slice of what we've been doing, and Robbie Love did some of this analysis with me. We've presented little bits of this before. We've been looking at polysemy, which is a challenge that teachers are very much aware of. And I've got a few examples of the polysemy here. So mean in key stage 2 is what you would expect. What does this mean? What does this mean? That tends to be, that's the majority of the citations. And we've got boxed there the mathematical use, the mean perimeter, mean in the technical word for average. In key stage 3, that's how it's used. That's the main meaning of it. Okay, so we've gone from a sort of everyday meaning through to this technical meaning from primary to secondary school. And here's a sort of close-up of the data from primary school, and a quotation from Emma at the bottom, obviously not her real name. We learned mean in maths. It was in the SATs practice test, the test that they have to do in May of their last year at primary school. I couldn't guess the meaning. We haven't heard mean in maths before. Okay. Another example, volume. And the quotation at the bottom, Jacob there says, you have volume on TV. Then you come across it in maths. Difficult to understand. It's a very perceptive quotation, actually. And when we looked at the data, the actual data, at the point when we did that analysis, we've got slightly more now, but at the point when we looked at that, we only had one citation in the primary school data set, and that was the meaning that Jacob mentions there. You have volume on TV. As the volume of music at the school disco became unbearable from a book that they were reading. Whereas at Key Stage 3, there were two different subjects where they encountered that. One was maths, so like the first citation, calculate the volume and surface area of a cuboid. And the other was biology, where they did lung volume, and essentially, of course, the same meaning. And that, of course, is a different meaning from the sound meaning, but obviously to a non-specialist educated adult, there isn't, possibly there isn't a problem, but there's certainly a problem for some children. And here's the Key Stage 3 citations, just magnified. So this is all from teacher talk, textbooks, and so on. And again, you can see the density there and collocations, lung volume, calculating volume, and so on. Okay, another one, concentrate. These were examples that pupils gave during the interviews, okay? Concentrate means to focus. Their teachers tell them to concentrate quite a lot. So the first two meanings, to focus and you're not distracted. Concentration camp comes up because a lot of schools use the boy in striped pyjamas the boy in striped pyjamas in their English lessons, mostly in the first year of secondary school. So obviously there's a high incidence of that word concentration camp in English. It also occurs in science, which is definitely what the bottom example is from, when stuff is really high, a high concentration. And the pointing towards one thing, I think, is the aim of that. Okay, I can see a couple of questions here, so I'll pause for a minute about those. In terms of teaching and learning, I'm afraid I don't have the answers to those. I think that our data could be used to look at that, but we haven't been looking at the uptake of students from that in this project. It's obviously, it's something that will be really important to do, but it's not something that we've been doing for this project. So I can't really sort of say anything about how the teacher talk affects what students learn, or about improving their learning, I'm afraid, because that's not what we were doing here. We were looking very much at language description. Eric has asked about mean girls. Students didn't mention mean as an adjective, in fact. And I don't know whether that's because they had some understanding of part of speech, but it wasn't one that came up. Question about, are students made aware of the polysemous nature of language at some point? No, they are not. But I would hope that this will be an outcome of this project. I've talked about polysemy at teachers' conferences. And I think for a lot of educated adults, people are aware of this once they're shown it, but they don't, they're just not aware of it. They're aware of the difficult words, the technical words. So every biology teacher who's teaching year 7, that's first year of secondary, knows that photosynthesis is going to be a difficult word. and, you know, chlorophyll, they know that those are going to be difficult words. And in some ways, of course, they're less difficult because here's a technical word and this is exactly what it means. Whereas words like release and response, the teachers aren't so much aware that those are going to be problematic, and neither are the students. So the students are maybe not only not understanding, but not knowing that they don't understand. Here's some data for concentrate, and again, there was only one occurrence in the data set that we had at the time, and you can, but a lot more in Key Stage 3. And you can see it comes from several different subject areas there. And there's some more of the Key Stage 3 data. Okay, some of the other things that students found difficult, and this was from the interview data and how it informed us. They found some of the technical words hard. Something else that we found was that if we asked students to read, and that was one of the things that we did in the interviews, we didn't spend half an hour or so talking to the students, just asking them lots of questions. We gave them prompt texts and we asked them what they thought was difficult about them, or how they responded to them and so on. And we found that if they could pronounce all the words, they thought things were okay. That was what reading was for them, even when they didn't necessarily understand the meaning of some of those words. So that's a bit worrying, and it suggests a focus in class on reading aloud without necessarily deep understanding. And then there were certain technical terms that have got everyday use. One of these that my colleagues looked at very closely is energy, which has got actually a really specialised meaning in physics that's not straightforward at all. But of course, young people think it is, and there's a whole cluster of words like this in science, like work, force, mass, and so on, which are actually really quite difficult concepts. But unlike the words at the top of this slide, they're not kind of flagged up as difficult. Okay, something that one of the research fellows, Deignan, has been working on is she's compared lesson PowerPoints across years 5 to 7. So that's ages 9 through to 12. And the PowerPoint is massively overused in British schools these days. Now, she found we've got year 5, which is age 9 to 10, year 6 is age 10 to 11, and year 7 is age 11 to 12. There's actually a dip in year 6 where the content becomes less challenging. And we don't know why that is, but we think it is probably because that's when they have their national exams. So what seems to happen in year 6, the end of primary school, is that the language challenge takes a back seat for a year because the students are doing a lot of past papers, studying for exams. My colleague found that the actual genre of the PowerPoint is quite different in secondary school from primary school. And of course, as we all know, if you try and read or understand something that's in a genre that you're not familiar with, it is much more difficult to absorb, because your expectations about what's going to happen, what's going to come next, just don't help you out there. Okay, so some early conclusions, and we've got a lot more to do. We've basically built the corpus and done a bit of playing around with it. The kind of like really substantive analysis is starting right around now. One of the things that teachers find really shocking is not so much the quality, the characteristics of the language at Key Stage 3, that is secondary school, from primary school, but the volume. There's much more of it. When a child age 11 goes from primary school to big school, secondary school, they are likely to experience 3 to 4 times more words per hour than they do in primary school. And when you add that to the challenge of suddenly being in an alien environment with a lot of much older pupils and having to negotiate a timetable and having subject specialist teachers rather than child-focused teachers, this volume of language is quite likely overwhelming for some students, which means that challenges of polysemy that maybe children could cope with if they came slowly with a lot of scaffolding become overwhelming. I think I've made quite a few of these points already. There's a higher frequency of academic words at Key Stage 3. Polysemous words occur with their field-specific meaning at Key Stage 3. Technical words aren't that common. They're not a big deal, really, either at primary school or secondary school. The big challenge, perhaps the same as at university, is the sub-technical words and the polysemous words. So those are some of the early conclusions. Just to take one example, which I mentioned before, changes in the language of maths. And I mentioned the sort of the problems, Katie has a ladder, Charlie has 5 sweets, and so on. In primary school, you get that sort of very personal, real world thing, everyday lexis, and possibly simpler grammar. And in secondary school, problems are expressed in purer, more abstract terms. So forget the ladders and the sweets and the pieces of fruit and so on. We're looking now just at the pure problem, which is more difficult for the child to engage with. Somebody has asked me about topics for action research. I think that's going to come up in just a minute. So as the project progresses, we'll get a clearer idea of where the difficulties are. So I think we're already getting some idea of where the difficulties are. And what we're aiming to do is to generate a list of the vocabulary of secondary schools so that we can say to teachers, to textbook writers, to syllabus designers, here is the new vocabulary. It was not encountered in primary school and it's unlikely to have been encountered outside the classroom. The children of highly educated families will struggle less with it, but the children of families whose parents are not highly educated are going to find it more difficult. And also we'll be looking at the sentence and discourse level. Now, we're not seeking to change what teachers do in schools. That won't work anyway. We're not talking about dumbing down anything in any way, but we're looking at putting in language support. If we took a school and we said, okay, make all of this simpler, either they wouldn't do it or those students ultimately would be disadvantaged because the students have to take national exams at the age of 15 or 16, and those are life-changing exams. So we can't make things easier, but we can put in that support. And this is perhaps where action research comes in. So ultimately then, the goal of this project is to try and improve social justice by enabling corpus-informed language interventions. And we hope that this will support children from lower socioeconomic status groups who don't have that same access to the language of school that the children from more privileged backgrounds have. So looking ahead, we're developing the classroom data set, we're doing more comparative analysis, we're doing comparisons between the different subjects, and we hope to revisit schools again in the autumn. We've done some dissemination to education professionals as well as in academic audiences. And they've been really well received. The most recent one, just before everything shut down in the UK, was in March, where I presented together with a teacher, Marcus Jones, who I mentioned. So we went together, sort of the academic and the teacher, and we spoke to an audience of teachers who are really engaged and interested in research. And that was just great. We really enjoyed doing it, and people were very enthusiastic. Someone's asked if students' permission is necessary for writing. I mean, we're not analysing student writing at the moment, but normally we would say yes, students' permission is necessary. The exception would be that some of the examination boards, I think, own examination scripts, so you would probably be able to get data from them, but normally we would say yes. And because the students are under 18, then of course we need parental consent as well for anything that might be at all sensitive. So it's a tricky area. Okay, so this is the website for the project at the University of Leeds. And as I said, I've uploaded the slides. That's my email and my Twitter handle. And we haven't written that much yet, but there's one thing that you can access if you're interested in it. An article that I've written together with 𝗵𝗿𝗱𝗂𝗪, and it's going to be published in Corpus shortly. But there's a preprint copy. There's a link from my Twitter feed, and it's also in the repository for my university. So the web things there. Somebody's asked about ESP. This is a kind of ESP for schools, yeah. So I was kind of partly inspired by what has been done at university level in ESP, but certainly in the British context, it's very little of that has been done in schools. And I think it's just so open to that kind of work, to doing that kind of research in schools. I think there is so much benefit from corpus linguistic methods to help level up, to help improve social justice in schools by giving children from less privileged background access to the genres of prestige, the genres that they need if they're going to do well in academic assessment and later on in prestigious professions.